introduction to Genesis chapter 1, and I'm going to just review very briefly a little bit of that. But there's so much in day 1 that I'm hoping that I can get through it this evening. But let's go ahead and get started and see how far we get. So we're going to look at day 1 in terms of some things that I think are some exciting things that have application to us here and now. That's why I've titled it Day 1 Speaks to Us Today, or Speaks to Us in the 20th Century. I mentioned last time, John Davis in his commentary says no other piece of ancient Near Eastern literature that has survived the ravages of time compares favorably with the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis, therefore, is of utmost value to the scientist, historian, and theologian. So it has application to our culture as well. Very important book. Henry Morris, the book of Genesis is probably the most important book ever written. That's quite a statement to make. It is so important that I think every Christian should be familiar with it, at least the early chapters. Francis Schaeffer used to say that without the first 3 chapters of the book of Genesis, you really cannot have a consistent Christian faith. In other words, the whole Christian faith is based on the early chapters of the book of Genesis. Last time I mentioned, because of its importance, we have noticed that the book of Genesis, probably more than any other book, has been under attack through the centuries, and particularly in the 1700s, 1800s, and in fact liberalism got its start undermining the book of Genesis. The historicity was one of the areas of attacks. So up front, what I'd like to mention to you, and I mentioned this last time, that I believe that what we have in the book of Genesis is a historical record. In other words, these are actual events. Now, I haven't developed that, and we'll look a little bit at that in other studies in Genesis 1, but there's so much in these early verses that I didn't want to spend the time doing that. And as part of the introduction, I had plenty there as well. So the events that we're looking at actually took place in time, and they are as they are recorded in the book of Genesis, and I believe that they are historical. Now, I didn't mention last time, just so you know, and I think all of you know who I am, but if you know anything about who I am, you know that I believe in the inspiration of Scripture. I also believe in the inerrancy of Scripture. In other words, that because it is inspired and God is the authority behind it, we believe, at least I believe, that it is inerrant. That means it does not have any errors. Now, there are many theologians, particularly in even evangelical churches, that believe in a form of inerrancy. And inerrancy, when Scripture pertains only to the areas of doctrine or theology or issues of spirituality, in those areas, there are many that believe that the Bible is inerrant. Now, these would be more conservative than the liberals. But I believe, and I think most of you believe, that the Bible is also inerrant when it also touches on issues of history. And we believe that a book like Genesis that deals with history, when it speaks to those issues, it also is without error. And I would hold to that viewpoint. And also, we would say that it is inerrant when it deals with any issue, including issues of science. And the Bible makes many statements that have scientific implications. In fact, the ones that we'll look at in Genesis chapter 1 have far-reaching scientific and even social ramifications, as we'll see. So the historicity, we ought to defend it. We can defend it. There have been attacks from science. That's pretty much the current debate. The issue of creation versus evolution, and I gave you some of the other issues related to science. I won't go over those. A third attack is even within the church. amongst well-meaning theologians, and we are aware that there's a whole segment of even somewhat conservative creationists, but they would hold to, I believe, an old earth viewpoint, and I think that actually is an attack on the text itself of Scripture. So, the book of Genesis has been under attack, which tells us this is an important book from the enemy's perspective. And certainly it is. I also mentioned, this is all by way of review, that the nation of Israel, I spent a lot of time trying to develop somewhat the cultural situation of the children of Israel when the book of Genesis was written, and some of the rationale that Moses had as he composes this book. And we mentioned that the children of Israel were well acquainted with the Egyptian polytheism because that's where they were at. And we don't have an exact date for the dating of the book of Genesis, but it's sometime around the Exodus. Personally, I think it was probably preparatory before the Exodus. It makes more sense. We also know that the children of Israel would leave that polytheism of the Egyptians, but they would also enter into another culture that was just as corrupt, just as polytheistic, in the land of Canaan. And they will also have contact eventually with Babylonian peoples, Assyrian peoples, that also had theologies and even stories of origins and stories of a flood. In fact, the well-known Enuma Elish, Babylonian, even predates the writings of Moses. And liberal scholars would say that Moses adapted his and drew from myths like Enuma Elish. But we would say that Enuma Elish goes back to an ancestral memory of those events, and it's certainly corrupted because it's not inspired and it's not inerrant. And we would have the inerrant and inspired version. So all of this background, the children of Israel needed to know who was this God that was leading them out of Egypt, and who was the God that ultimately would give them the law and would enter into covenant with them. And the book of Genesis, I think, largely serves that purpose, and it starts at a logical place. If you know about the origins, then you know a lot about not only your own people, but you also know a lot about the God that has led you out. So I see the book as a polemic against many of these theologies. The polemic is an apologetic or an argument that goes against these, and we see that very early. In fact, a lot of time I spent last week on that. I want you to keep in mind one of the major differences between the Genesis account, in other words, the accurate, inspired account of who God is a very fundamental issue here. And I think you can simplify just about every belief system, and that includes the paganism of our day, and the paganism of all of history, and the paganism that existed in Egypt, and all of those ancient cultures. Every single one of them, all the way to the 21st century, they believe in what's called the continuity of being in terms of God's relationship to nature, or to the creation, or to the universe, or to everything that's out there. There's a continuity of being. I don't know if I emphasized this enough last time, so I'd like to kind of stress it again. Because this is a major issue between the true God and all of these polytheistic cultures. This argument against this continuity of being. And right from the beginning, Moses begins and does that. The alternative, and it's only the Bible, it's only the God of the Bible that you find this distinction between the Creator and the creation. And you see that from the very, very first phrase in Genesis. So it starts out arguing against this whole idea. So that's very fundamental. You need to kind of cement that in your mind. That'll simplify. In other words, what is the fundamental, what is the essential difference between the God of the Bible and the God of all other peoples, all other cultures, all other belief systems, all through history? And this little key is basically it. In the beginning, in other words, before there is anything, before there is a universe, God, Elohim. And what does that tell you? There's a distinction, there's a separateness. The God of the Bible, the true God, is separate and distinct from that He has created. And in fact, He brought it about. And we would believe that He brought it about out of nothing. And we talked some about that last time. So that fundamental difference begins with the very first phrase in the Bible. In the beginning, God existed. So it speaks of His eternality, and we'll get into some of these issues. So one of the main things that Moses is doing in Genesis 1, and in fact all through Genesis, is giving us a picture of who God is, the one true God. It lays the foundation for everything else. Historically, it lays the foundation for everything else in the rest of the Bible. It lays the foundation for all of theology concerning the nature and character of God. And I see probably the relationship best sketched on this, the structure of these passages. First, I think we have an introductory summary statement. Verse 1. I think the grammar probably is best taken in this way, and I gave you some of the reasons on that. One thing I forgot to mention, that most of that material that I gave you was from Bruce Waltke in a series of articles, and he's written some pamphlets and some other areas where he lays out some of these those views and other views. And this is predominantly his view, where he sees verse 1 as a summary statement, which is typical Hebrew style. They'll give you a summary statement and then follow that with the details. So Genesis 1:1, from Waltke's perspective, now I differ with him on one small point. He sees the following as a recreation, and I don't think that's necessarily, and I'll talk some more about that in a moment. But secondly, we have verse 2, a series of circumstantial clauses. Remember, we developed that, where we have the pre-creation situation, or the initial stages of God's creation. And then we have the creation narrative. Now, one of the other views sees verses 1 through 5 as day 1. From this structure, day 1 would begin in verse 3. And verse 3 would be the beginning of the creation narrative. So day 1 would simply be verses 3 through 5. And then there's a concluding summary statement in chapter 2 at the end, and something of a Sabbath epilogue. So this is the structure that I will be following. I think it best captures the structure of this whole passage. And this evening we'll just look at day 1. And what I'm going to emphasize, and on your outline sheets, everybody have an outline sheet? In the margin there I've got 7, or is there 8? I think I added an 8th one, 8 numbers there. They will correspond to these implications. There's at least 8 major implications from just day 1 of the creation account. And the first implication deals with the nature of God. And we dealt with this somewhat by way of introduction last time, but I'd like to re-emphasize it because it is so important to remind you the nature of the God of the Bible, which is a major emphasis of Genesis chapter 1. Now it says, in the beginning, Elohim, there's the Hebrew word, Elohim, with the English transliteration, or God. Now, if you know Hebrew, immediately in Hebrew, when you have an im, that's these last letters here, it's a plural, which is very interesting, that God is plural.